This is a microphone. Red leather, yellow leather. Yep.
Well, we were just setting up the Zoom. But
Okay.
it'll
Have that.
this will change to the Zoom screen.
Okay.
And she'll be up in the
Okay.
corner.
And you'll switch that in the back.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds easy.
And then anytime to talk to her, you just gotta talk into a mic.
Okay.
But it's just a tape, right? It's just
No, she's live.
Okay.
I may want to turn this one on.
I just have that one on, but are you gonna sit down?
I don't think so. I think the only speaker will be at the podium, and there will be speakers in the audience, so we'll need those later on.
The Q&A,
Q&A.
yeah, okay.
But yeah, I think that's all.
Yeah, so it should start like this.
Okay.
You'll see, so.
I see. So yeah, that's the Zoom on. Okay. And is it shown that the speaker joined at all?
I am gonna go check, but I think
Can't do anything either.
We are gonna be the first ones talking, right?
Yes.
It's just gonna be us.
I feel like she got it, maybe she got it fixed because I've been watching her on the screen, but, yeah, so.
So I'm gonna ask you
Okay, so I'm gonna go grab my sweater, and I've got everyone's, yeah, yeah.
the same. Sure. I'll see you on Zoom, right? Yeah. Okay.
Go back. Go to see from here.
And women who Yeah. Okay. Oh no. No, tell me more. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Wow. Great. Yes. Awesome. So we're actually, if it's still going, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, right on, right on. So you know, it's a, like, if you play the interface. Yeah, I know the policy is for next the time. Cool. Yeah, yeah. You need it just outside. Squishes.
We're dealing with some Zoom updates, so.
That's a better problem than the speaker not showing.
No, that's very true. So it'll be probably 5 or 10 minutes before we get started. Thank you for your patience. All right. So that's one time. A lot of time.
Nice to meet you.
I think that she is now joined. I think she's now joined, so we're just waiting for people to come in. And I think she's, yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, she can just wait for people to come in.
We got 74 people online. I'm just ready to go. I'm ready to go and Bill's ready to go.
Okay. I can find you. You are findable.
this works, I'm gonna fix my last keynote, I'm gonna get it right on the third try. Well, we should be successful last year, all the 5 people who follow us on YouTube. So, yeah, wherever she's ready to go, I'm here. I'll get started when she is, because we need to keep on schedule for the 10:30 sessions.
Hi, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. All right, I'm gonna go let them know that we're gonna get started at 8:40, so people need to get.
Hi, Linda. Could you say hi, just to make sure that your audio is working?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Dear Digital Humanities community, thank you for your patience. We'll get started now. This conference brings us together as a vibrant and creative community, offering an opportunity to showcase our work on digital humanities, exchange ideas, and learn from each other across the world. At the same time, the world around us bears witness to a transformative moment in history in many ways. We are grappling with the environmental and ethical implications of big tech and other organizations, technological, read also artificial intelligence, usage in harmful ways, from warfare to surveillance. The extractive land and labor practices, the depleting sources of materials that make our technological hardware, the looming threat of man-made climate change from this, the devastating global catastrophes that nations wrought onto each other, onto others, the fiercely fought battles for worker rights, the ethical dilemmas that loom large in our collective consciousness on all these issues.
These are all subjects with humanistic imperatives that are relevant to each of us, regardless of our subject matter expertise. Over these next few days, the conversations we'll be engaging in during this conference will serve as a way to reaffirm our core values, not only concerning these pressing issues, but also on our beloved field of digital humanities, the academy and beyond, in practice. It's our hope that this following keynote address will ignite a spark that radiates throughout the digital humanities community, a spark that will compel us to hold ourselves accountable to the responsible application of digital and data tools for critical research that is meaningful to the world around us.
With immense gratitude and excitement on behalf of the DH2024 Program Committee, we welcome the incredible Linda Nagari, our distinguished keynote speaker for today. We have earnestly requested her to share her work, particularly with insights into the conference theme of responsibility. Linda Nagari is a journalist in Kenya, experienced in open source investigative journalism, and trained in fact-checking journalism. She's a data journalist and digital rights advocate with a bachelor's degree in communications from Daystar University in Kenya. Nagari's work has been featured on platforms such as BBC Africa Eye, Global Voices, Face to Face Africa, Code for Africa, and Africa Uncensored. Her work is in both English and Swahili.
Notably, she is a recipient of the International Center for Journalists Michael Elliott Award for Excellence in African Storytelling and Amnesty International Media Awards Gabby Rado Award for New Journalists. These are remarkable achievements that celebrate her work on health and gender reporting about abortion rights in Kenya. She directed Breaking the Silence, Abortion Rights in Kenya for BBC Africa Eye, spotlighting challenges faced by Kenyan women. She's also the recipient of the International Sports Press Association and Media Council Sports Journalism Awards for an open source investigation on a Ponzi scheme targeting betting fans in Kenya.
Linda is an inspiration for the activism many in our field have already embraced, but there is more that can be done. With her commitment to intentional storytelling, transparency, she has set a high standard for digital and data literacy. Today, she'll be sharing with us the incredible potential of data journalism when wielded with the ethics of responsibility and care. Please join me in welcoming, giving a warm welcome to Linda Nagari. Asante. Linda, thank you for joining us today. Take it away.
Thank you. So I am trying to share my video, but I don't know why that's not possible. But I hope my voice will suffice. But if my video permissions have been updated, I'm happy to switch it back on. So my name is Linda. Thank you for the chance to be part of this, even though I couldn't make it physically. I am a journalist from Kenya, and I usually joke that I have won a sports journalism award, but I know close to nothing about sports, no offense, but it's because of just the stories that I did around digital rights and how they're connected to, and the story is particularly about a betting scam in Kenya that was targeting football fans. So I was able to tell a sports story and its intersection with digital rights because there was a farm that was basically making rounds in East Africa just via Facebook. So that is a bit of what I'm going to look at today. And I'll get into sharing my slides because
Hi,
you can see my face. And
my apologies.
hello?
One moment. Could you please try to share your screen and turn on your video now? Amazing.
Yeah.
I see you. And could you try to share
Hi.
your screen as well?
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
Oh, nice. All right. I don't know if I should start from the beginning, but
Yes.
really,
I think it
okay.
might be best to start from the beginning. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So as per the introduction, my name is Linda from Kenya. And as I have mentioned before, I I have worked in investigating digital rights in East Africa in particular. And I usually joke about how I've won a sports journalism award without necessarily knowing much about sports because of my interest in digital rights. So my story in sports was mostly looking at how a Ponzi scheme circulated just on Facebook and scammed hundreds of citizens from Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And it was actually a scam that was registered in the UK, apparently had offices in Dubai, but was targeting people in East Africa. So part of my passion projects is just looking at how interesting really the digital space is borderless pretty much. So anyone can reach and scam literally anyone from anywhere in the world, but the only barrier to that would be access to information and digital literacy. That's the only way to kind of protect ourselves and those near us or those that we love from the borderless digital scams and harms that could come our way. So I'll go right into my presentations. I am looking at tackling misinformation and questioning platform integrity just based on the work that I have done before in fact checking that is very heavy on collecting data from social media platforms. But again, because of the nature of the business that is, this data is often very guarded and is mostly accessible to very specific groups of people. Meta has its own guidelines for who it allows to collect data about their users. So does TikTok and other platforms. So as a journalist, it has been a challenge to try and tell stories, for example, about the betting scam that was basically across, that's like intercontinental Ponzi scheme, but clearly the aim was to target lesser aware people, lesser educated people in this part of the world. So it is important for journalists, for example, to access data from big tech. It's always been such a challenge. And that's some of the things that I will be questioning and looking at through this particular presentation. So welcome. And this is about me. I will not go back into that again. But my work again is around information ecosystems, questioning disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And the scale is on the perpetrator. We call them perpetrators. I don't know if they go by any different name, but mostly the people behind spreading and circulating misinformation. So the scale goes is measured by the intent to cause harm, because most of us have been maybe victims to misinformation without knowing, but then the real perpetrators are those that spread misinformation with the intent to cause harm. So that's the definition of disinformation, basically, in a nutshell, is misinformation circulated by people with the intent to cause harm. But there's also misinformation, which is just false information without the intent to cause harm, and malinformation, which could be true, but ends up causing harm eventually. But I won't dwell into that much. So the intersection of platforms and journalism scales widely, and hence the need for big tech to open up their data for journalists to actually question what's going on these platforms. So there's the potential to cause harm, which is a fact checker's guide, basically, because while fact checking, we look at what is the possibility of this information to cause harm. So in my fact checking days, we'd come across a lot of information that could be false, but doesn't necessarily cause harm. So you could have an image of a rosy garden and someone says it's a beautiful day today in Kenya, but probably the rosy garden is somewhere in Venice. So those are some of like the guidelines that we don't usually look at as fact checkers because there's basically no harm. But in the potential to cause harm, there could be the plausible cause for harm, which is where pre-banking comes in, where fact checkers look at, for example, during an election, what kind of information have we seen spreading that is false in previous elections and what could possibly spread in current elections. So the potential to cause harm is important. And the health implication, for example, we had a case of yoni steaming products in Kenya that were getting sold on Facebook and YouTube. And these platforms actually received revenue in ad payments from the people who are selling these harmful products that were indeed found by doctors to be harmful, but were selling on Facebook and could never sell in physical stores because of the laws that we have. So a lot of women ended up buying these yoni steaming products and ended up getting affected just because it's a borderless and it's, would I say lawless? There's no laws to what goes or doesn't go on social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube, which are more common in East Africa. So health implications could also be, during COVID-19, we found a lot of alleged concussions that could sell because they're allegedly supposed to cure COVID-19, but that's not true. But we've still seen them circulating now, even past COVID, even before COVID, or this concussion could cure cancer, or this and that and the other, which is just false. But the harm there is in the legally and medically tested to be poisonous products that are actually being promoted on social media platforms. And in mobilizing, for example, there's a protesting going on in Kenya at the moment, and it started on X, formerly Twitter, and people were just circulating the hashtag the finance bill should not proceed. It was just a mere hashtag, and it translated into physical protests. So more and more we are seeing, and even in Nigeria, there was the NSAS movement that started as a hashtag, but ended up being physical protests. And so there's a lot of movements currently that are showing us that social media could legitimately be a space for civic engagement. And before, we had leaders in this part of the world that would ignore, for example, tweets, because they'd say it's not really people, it's just, and sometimes it is not really people, it could be coordinated campaigns. But more and more we are seeing that organizing on digital platforms should not be trivialized. Rather, it could actually bring about civic engagement in a powerful way, which is what we've seen in Kenya, because that particular hashtag led to the finance bill that was supposed to increase taxes to be rejected. It's what we saw in Nigeria, where the NSAS movement led to change in policies, and at least there was, they said, to be a reduction in police brutality after the NSAS movement. So social media is a tool for mobilizing. And again, I say journalists could really use access to this data, because how then can we tell that there's social impact out of such movements? And I go back to access to such data because, for example, when Twitter changed to become X, there's a lot of tools that were disabled that used to help journalists, for example, gather data or report on what's going on social media platforms. We had social listening tools like TweetDeck, Tweetonomy. The whole algorithm was changed, and we've not since had a way to access free tools. It's important for them to be free because, again, for it to be of public good, I believe it should be openly accessible for researchers and journalists to find it. So it has been a challenge to access data without like having all the resources to afford very expensive tools like Meltwater and Brandwatch. So yeah, mobilizing as a tool on social media platforms has become increasingly powerful. And also financial implications through, as I'd mentioned, the example of the Ponzi scheme that was registered, again, I repeat, in the UK, alleged to have offices in Dubai, but was targeting people in East Africa. And we could collect this data through a partnership and collaboration with a bigger organization, which is how a lot of data journalists have been working, by pulling together resources and forming like a collective where they can at least afford a tool or appeal as a union to access tools. So we could access information about this Ponzi scheme that was circulating in East Africa through CrowdTangle, which is, again, something I'm going to get into because Facebook apparently wants to disable CrowdTangle at such a crucial time when a lot of countries within this year alone have elections. I think it's about more than 60 countries in the world. So there couldn't be a worse time to disable CrowdTangle. So this is just an example of there's a type of the potential to cause harm. Sorry. Because this was just before the Kenyan elections, and it's just a graphic showing the presentation of hate speech in Kenya before the elections. And I understand this is also going on in the US and other parts of the world as a lot of countries are going into elections. So again, there couldn't be a worse time to disable CrowdTangle and for Twitter or X rather, to disable, to change its algorithm and limit access to information about what's going on these online platforms. Another part of wrongdoing and potential to cause harm and harm done is in the rapid rise of disinformation professionals, so to say. So this is an example of how much was spent by state actors in the US for propaganda services. There's a story I particularly worked on called Digital Warlords, following just how these propaganda services work. And they usually just hire university students, for example. And in this particular case, I was following it, a propaganda service offered by a group just before the Kenyan election. And they would hire groups of young university students. They would mobilize via WhatsApp groups. So again, it's cross-platform in that kind of way. No one is meeting physically. It's just meeting up in groups online or on Facebook, coordinating a way. So they would say, ideally for platform manipulation to work out, you need to have about, let's say, 50 accounts posting continuously on the same topic for about 2 hours. And they would use the same words so that a particular phrase may get picked up and quickly rise through the trending topics of the day. So what I realized for the person who's taking up these jobs, it's just, if it is a student, for example, in Kenya, it's just a job like any other. It's just a way to make ends meet. But the responsibility, should it be upon platforms to regulate platforms? Again, I go back to why it is important to have journalists accessing this data, because most times, as we've realized, there was that particular campaign just before the Kenyan elections, and there was also a campaign that was sponsored by a Spanish right-wing organization called Citizen Go, and was running in Kenya, that was campaigning against a bill that would, introduce abortion rights and surrogacy rights in Kenya. So before this particular investigation, no one had raised alarms about it. And I get it, maybe Meta does serve like a very, very, very wide audience. It's possibly like the single, it's basically a country on its own without laws and without borders, and people can sell stuff, they can communicate, they can organize just on that platform. So before we did these investigations, we'd sometimes communicate to Meta, and once or twice maybe they would pull down the campaigns or the accounts behind these campaigns. Sometimes you just don't get a response. So, and this would have taken journalists, like I've mentioned, resources and a big team of researchers to collect and scrap this information. So if we can't access the data, and if it takes like rounds and rounds of emails for these accounts to be pulled down, why then don't you just allow this data to be, openly accessible? So usually when you flag these campaigns, they would go into like publish a report saying, we noticed that this and this and this is going on after it was flagged. But it really isn't that they noticed. It was someone that actually raised alarm, probably after carrying out research, after paying for a tool that would pull down all these accounts. So why then wouldn't you just allow for this information to be freely accessible so that people can just engage freely, and transparency doesn't have to go through the platform itself before it's, there's action taken? Anyway, there's been that form of transparency through big tech and social media platforms where they publish reports after people raising alarms. For example, this is a graph from OpenAI's report that was showing the rate of misinformation and how OpenAI in particular has been used to circulate misinformation. And the highest rate is through impersonation. An example of which was when during the Israel Hamas conflict, a lot of Al Jazeera journalists were impersonated, and there would be accounts of non-existent people created claiming to be journalists from Al Jazeera, and they would allegedly, from like an authoritative standpoint, communicate about the war going on, but you'd realize that they were either pro-Israeli or pro-Hamas, but really they were not journalists from Al Jazeera. And another form of increasingly alarming source of misinformation from artificial intelligence is the production of mass content. And up here is an organization called NewsGuard, that tracked a bunch of news bots that would claim to offer credible information, but it just copies the format of a news article. This is the article, it kind of looks newsy, but you'd find a lot of articles on that particular news website, but it also contains misinformation because there is no one checking the kind of information that goes into these websites. So NewsGuard has been a great tool to like track news bots that are spreading misinformation, and that's misinformation that is AI generated to kind of present what should be news, the job of a journalist, making journalists defunct. In fact, one of the creators of these news bots says journalists have been gathering information from different platforms just to recreate it and present it as new information. So that's something a tool can do. But as a hardcore journalist, I strongly disagree because there's a lot that goes on into a story. And we can see the sort of demeaning of the journalistic profession has led to the creation of a lot of news bots and AI-generated sources of news, with people who claim that, we can churn out more news. There's the harm of churning out more information than was possible, and that is even possible for fact checkers to get a hold of and fact check in good time. So there's the battle with quantity over quality. So as per this chart, these are other forms of misinformation emanating from products by OpenAI, besides impersonation and mass content creation. There's the falsification of documents, faking online identities, among other uses of artificial intelligence to spread misinformation. So it goes back to, we now just rely on platforms to give us what the information, and through their transparency reports, as they call them, to give us the information that we are hoping we could find for ourselves. But again, that has been and is very limited. So platform moderation, as per my point previously, is very limited. And for example, this is a guide on how Meta's systems moderate content. And these particular examples you see are content that did not get flagged, because one of the key guides on what should be flagged as hateful or false information is that it has to be targeted to a specific group. And if you've used, for example, ChatGPT, if you can stay away from certain words, but because you can work around it, you can still get information. For example, if you target, if you say, for example, the words like Black women in particular, that would get flagged because it's specific to a group, or queer persons, you'd realize that some prompts won't give you results, but you can always work around it and would still get results. So these are examples of posts that wouldn't get flagged because of the content moderation guides that are in place, which are not very reliable and cannot really, they're not a reflection of human communication, because language evolves all the time. And for example, with the Israel-Palestine war, there's the use of the watermelon symbol to represent Palestine. But that's not something that's on the content moderation guidelines, or that their content moderation systems would automatically pick out. Just going to say that if you're not going to invite human beings to be collaborators in this moderation process, then you're not really doing the work of moderating. So things like, we're being humiliated by the Western unbelievers. We must protect Islam from Judeo-Christian forces. These are very polarizing. As you can tell that these are polarizing and hateful posts. But to tell you, the system wouldn't speak this out. And I had an example of a post by BBC's campaign to the case where teenage girls in the UK were going to become, to get married off to ISIS. And this was a campaign that resonated with a specific group, but was very harmful to another sect of people. I'm just going to play it and take note of the comments that come up after the video. What do you think? We did 5 times. 6 times. It's only 3 days till the beheading, and I've got no idea what I'm going to wear. All right, that's just a snippet of what the video looks like. But as you can see, what is harmful or what is offensive to one group of people is not offensive to another group of people. So again, speaking to the borderless, lawless nature of social media platforms. So do we still rely on the same platforms to tell us this is wrong and this is not, this is wrong and this is right, when we know what we know? For example, in South Africa, they have a celebration where women are out in the field dancing, and their bodies are, especially the breasts and the upper side, they don't wear anything, and it is a cultural practice. But these posts, when they get up on Facebook, while it's a celebration to locals in South Africa, it's flagged as explicit content on social media platforms. So who again is making these rules, and why do they have to apply across the board when my culture, for example, has a different interpretation of things? So with this particular video, it was targeted for young girls in the UK, but again, it reached people across the board. So while it was a campaign that worked, because the Real Housewives of ISIS was supposed to be like wordplay, to show young girls, oh, do you want to live these kinds of lives? So it's also something that would only resonate to someone who knows what the Real Housewives of stands for, which is not, again, something that cuts across all cultures and all religion and everything. So it did, according to the BBC, this campaign actually did work for girls in the UK. But again, as you may have seen in the comments, it didn't bode well with people from other parts of the world. Sorry. So, well, the platforms have shown us that, here you go, we can give you transparency reports. We're working on this, and these are the kinds of campaigns that were happening. Oh, there's this amount of impersonation on OpenAI and all that. But when it comes to like giving access to this data, there's just almost no action. So for example, Meta announced it will be abandoning CrowdTangle, and it had to take a campaign by Mozilla, which is still ongoing, and there's not been a verdict so far. So they had to mobilize and reach thousands of people who have been beneficiaries of the CrowdTangle tool to appeal as a collective to Meta not to disable the tool that is CrowdTangle, because of how it has helped indeed keep them transparent. And are we going to leave, again, I ask, are we going to leave it to the platforms to hold themselves accountable? And it's not even about what we can or cannot do, it's that they decide that they're going to give this amount of transparency and hold back with certain allowances. For example, with CrowdTangle, and as I'd mentioned, when Twitter became X, a lot of tools that were open source that would help us, actually, like local journalists in this part of the world, contextualize what's going on social media accounts. You assess the kind of language that is being used. We would trace the campaigns that were running in local languages like Swahili, and in Kenya, for example, you have like 48 other languages. So we could use keywords to track what people are saying on social media. These are things that could have bypassed, or are indeed bypassing, the existing content moderation systems, because again, they're just not as conclusive. So we would use tools like CrowdTangle, we'd use tools like in the former Twitter, we'd use tools like Twittonomy and TruthNest to just speak to people like us in languages that they understand. So again, I ask, are we going to leave it to platforms to regulate themselves? And as I've mentioned before, data collection has been a very hectic task for journalists because for example, on TikTok, for example, there's also a limitation to who can access data. And while largely journalists there's that allowance for journalists to access this data, but there's also a need for access for this data by researchers, for example, even the general public, I would say, because again, the social media space has become such a useful tool across the board. So yeah, who should hold the mandate for accountability and transparency for big tech and social media platforms? That is my presentation. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was a wonderful presentation. We'll start taking questions from the audience. Our microphone has gone missing, so actually, our microphone has not gone missing. So if you can, if you have questions you would like to ask Linda, if you could go ahead and come down to one of the microphones, and then I will call on you if you have a question.
Can I just answer one that I've seen on the chat while
Yes.
I wait for the last question? So I wish I could share the link, but so the y-axis represents amount. It's just like it's a representation of the amount of misinformation versus the type of misinformation. So it's divided in divisions of 5, 10, 15, 20. The report is a public report. I don't know that I can share the link on the chat and it would reach people. I don't know.
You should be able to share the link in the chat. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll do.
Yes, if you could come up to the microphone, please. Oh, microphone right there.
Say it's a little intimidating to come right up onto the stage. Linda, thank you so much. This was fantastic and so illuminating. I was very excited by the perspective you offer specifically from a space of journalism. And I think many at this conference are coming from a space that is publicly engaged, but also academic. In other words, it's framed around a research enterprise that is, seeking truth, seeking, the kinds of fact-checking, the kinds of standards that you hold, that journalists hold themselves to. We share that, but at the same time, there's a different set of practices or methods that are used to get there. And so the perspectives that you offered about the methods and the practices in data journalism were really illuminating to me. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how journalistic training is evolving, and particularly, in the spaces that you are working in, how journalistic training is evolving to address the kinds of challenges that you've described. And thank you again, that was wonderful.
Do I just go ahead and answer, or are we taking a couple of questions first?
If we could just answer one at a time, I think that would be best.
All right. Well, that's a very good question because I mentioned a lot about like achievements, but I forgot to say that most of this work that I'm doing is mostly learning on the job and learning through collaborative spaces, because when I was in journalism school, it was not a thing really, looking at how we can report based on what's going on online. And we weren't even really equipped with tools. So what I have seen, there's you might be familiar with the International Fact Checking Network, which is the global body for all fact checking organizations, and it incubates different fact checking organizations. For example, personally, I am a beneficiary from how it incubates African organizations. So it has been a new form of journalism, because as we may know, journalism wasn't it dying, or is dying, or has been dying. So personally, I took that route because I couldn't get into the mainstream space, as it were. So there'd be like small organizations that get grants to train from the IFCN. And it has also been like a way of generating revenue, to be honest, for newsrooms, by taking up fact checking and data journalism training as a product. So offering or acquiring grants for training journalists. So they would train local journalists, student journalists in fact checking and data. And again, there's very, very few organizations, selected organizations, for example, that are IFCN signatories. There's thousands of fact-checking organizations, but IFCN, for example, in Kenya alone, I think there's only 2 verified organizations. So they constantly open up trainings for this kind of new innovative journalism, as they put it. And now, for example, you'd find the likes of me who'd like now go on to get trained and work for them. And then it becomes a new form of journalism where you become a full-time trainer. So you again like could start your own classes for journalism, where you train specifically in fact checking and open source investigative techniques. But again, as I'd mentioned before, there's always been the challenge of acquiring resources, for example, to subscribe to tools like Brandwatch and Meltwater, just to be able to show that this is how much you can do by, knowing about these tools, and you can use them to tell stories in this kind of way and investigate in this kind of way. So it is a new wave of journalism, to answer your question, and a lot of global interest and a lot of global partners and institutional collaborations have allowed other journalists to pick it up and even branch on their own as specifically OSINT or data journalists.
All right, we have another question from the room. Linda? If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Is this microphone?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Linda. I'm Arjun from India. Actually, I have a question. If you know about Indian journalistic space today, a large number of commentators actually speak about the major media houses as being laptops of the government. And one of the things that's seen is that large part of what goes on as journalism in India today is basically putting a spin or basically editorializing. And large media houses do not actually have enough people on the ground to actually do ground reporting, let alone fact checking. So my question to you is this a larger phenomena, and is there a relation between how this kind of misinformation flows, finds it easier to flow because of the lack of ground reporting? And also, sometimes there's this practice of media houses to restrict journalists from speaking their mind on social media. And bringing them under editorial control, even on social media. So I want you to comment on these two points.
Yeah, I would say I have also seen a similar kind of thing in Kenya as well as East Africa about there being a gap in mainstream or ground work reporting. But again, as I have mentioned from my experience, journalism has been a very shifty career or space in the recent days. For example, in the current protests in Kenya, we've actually found out that some politicians have bought some media organizations, and the mainstream or ground reporting, as it were, is again very, like, lately we've realized revenues are moving more into the digital space. And then there's, because of the increase in information on social media and other alternative sources, trusting media has really gone down. And not to say that now let's not trust in everything that goes into ground and mainstream reporting, because there's a danger in that. No one actually believes anything because of the huge wave of misinformation that's going on online. And yes, mainstream media has had its own faults, probably has gotten to be biased in some instances, but there's a harm in just putting it as a blanket statement that all media is rogue. So yes, there has been a gap in ground reporting, which has been something that journalists have been trying to regain, once again, trust in media, but not very successfully, especially now more than ever, with a lot of information, and AI just doesn't help the situation. As I have pointed out, like the rising news boards saying, well, anyone can do a journalist's work. And there's a harm in that, because again, there's nothing to be believed. The harm here, I think, is trust in literally not just media, but even leaders and everything. But it has helped on the other side for accountability journalism, because I would say during election reporting, for example, fact checkers really play a useful tool in using, for example, open data sources to fact check what is said during presidential debates, for example. Maybe I would use again Kenyan example. For example, the incumbent was claiming that they've built this amount of roads in this particular amount of time, but because of the fact-checking knowledge, you understand to look out for the numbers, because they can always be exaggerated, and even the dates. For example, if at a presidential debate, someone could claim that they've done a certain kind of job, but they're just reporting what is already there, but was done by their predecessor. And they're kind of using it to say that this is what I did. Again, because of open data, we're able to tell, for example, if someone exaggerates the amount of work they've done or tries to minimize the amount of work that was done by their opponent. So it's a double-edged sword. We can even, for example, there's a tool called Full Fact AI that specifically picks out things like data in mainstream media or dates in mainstream media publications automatically. It's an AI tool that puts this out automatically, and in an attempt to help fact checkers catch up with the quantity of misinformation. So once you have this database by Full Fact AI, you can just go and check what you can, like the 10 things you can fact check during that day after they've already been sifted out by an AI tool. So that, I think, is a gap for researchers and people in developing technology or emerging technology, to develop tools that kind of have metrics for how we can fact check mainstream media or social media posts. And one of the ways is that by picking out numbers mentioned in a specific report, or the people or the dates that are mentioned.
Great, thank you. Linda, I have a couple questions I want to ask you from our online participants. So the first question is from Afalasade Ola, and they ask, how can researchers, data journalists get ahead of inaccessibility on social media platforms?
So this is, I am hoping to see that the Mozilla campaign does actually, it's like a prayer that they actually miraculously stop CrowdTangle from being disabled. But I have seen that approaching these platforms as a collective has worked. So it's not just an anonymous organization from somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Europe, but approaching these platforms as a collective, which I think has also worked for legislation in Europe, for example. When approaching big tech, it approaches the platforms as a collective, which I think has been resonating more and applies more pressure. There's like a bigger harm in, or rather a possible impact on the profits that they would make by just, coming as a complete body. We haven't really had that much success in Africa, for example, with Uber. In Kenyan Twitter spaces, that's also a story I'm working on, like just tracking the number of times people have been assaulted by Uber drivers in Kenya because there's just not enough regulation, and there's been lawsuit after lawsuit, but the government does not support Uber drivers, or we've failed as the African Union, for example, to approach big tech. So what we're seeing lately is that Uber drivers are really harassing their customers because they keep wanting to get paid more than what is on the app itself. So when you hail a cab, you'd be asked to pay a certain amount, but when you arrive at your destination, the Uber driver would ask you for more because they say the commission that is cut is higher than what can sustain them. And in the end, there's just no support. So that's a whole other story, but approaching these platforms as a collective, I am crossing fingers that the Mozilla campaign works because it has brought together thousands and thousands of organizations from across the board. I think that is more feasible as a way to approach them. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from inside the auditorium.
Hello. So it seems like the digital humanities and open source intelligence, we're both using computational methods, and we're using much larger amounts of information than people are used to making sense of. So thinking about groups like Bellingcat or forensic architecture, they can reconstruct in great detail with immense amounts of data what happened in a specific event. And we can do similar things with large humanities data sets. And oftentimes it's hard, we're making arguments with that data, with those methods, but oftentimes it's so novel to people, or we're just not accustomed to processing that much information. I was interested if you could share some examples from journalism of articles or projects that have really had an impact using these new methods and massive amounts of information.
Okay. I don't know if I could share them on the chat, but like the one I've mentioned about reproductive rights in Kenya, that was huge because it even targeted female political leaders, and it was very impactful because for the first time we learned that this organization that was behind it was not even African or Kenyan. It was a Spanish right-wing organization. I can share the link on the chat. This was one that was done by Mozilla Foundation, and I think there was impact on that because it brought in the foreign influence aspect. And it also, because of the way Mozilla works, it was also introduced to other organizations to republish and approach this problem as a collective. So the impact that I would say is that these accounts were widely shared. So there was a lot of digital literacy around that particular story. And there was also these particular accounts were brought down. But for the first time, we also saw how this organization was even paying people to spread misinformation about women and kind of spread smear campaigns that were anti-choice and even anti-queer. And it kind of became the first standpoint for other following investigations about influence operations in East Africa. I have another example during elections that collected. This one was, I would say this one is specifically very impactful because even the government took wind of it. It was using Swahili words, as I've mentioned, that would only make sense to a Swahili speaker to spread hate speech during the elections. And because we have post-election violence history in Kenya, it would even like ask for people who are of a different ethnicity to get killed. And these were very well mobilized on Facebook. So an organization called Code for Africa tracked and came up with like a lexicon of the words that were used in this campaign, circulating hate speech during elections, and it was picked up by the government. And now these specific words would actually be, it even got into mainstream media, and it was escalated as well with Meta. So for the first time, we saw that Swahili words were actually flagged, which is not a common scenario, but it came out of all the work that went into collecting Facebook posts that were using these words and coming up with a database. I can share the reports on the chat or the Q&A.
Thank you, Linda. I have one more question from inside the auditorium. Please ask your question.
Hello, and thank you for this presentation. My name is Milena Dobrev. I work in the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, in Scotland. And I have my first question is centered on developments which happen in Europe. So for several years now, the European Union is working on the EU Code of Practice on disinformation, which aim is to persuade different platforms to actually provide more visibility of how they're tackling various aspects of disinformation. So this work started back in 2018. Some platforms joined, then some started dropping, like Twitter. And I was wondering, from your experience, is this going to be an answer? You mentioned the importance of the work with the platforms. Is this approach going to produce something valuable on a longer term? I have a couple of more questions. The second one is around fact-checking. What worries me is that there is a business model around fact-checking. You mentioned IFCN, and a number of fact-checkers are actually gaining incomes from doing the fact-checking work. As a journalist, what do you think about this? Besides IFCN, there is EDMO in Europe, the European Digital Media Observatory, which also certifies fact-checkers and has a network of 14 regional hubs across Europe doing fact-checking, among other things. But what do you think about organizations which actually gain money? And my last question is probably most relevant to this particular conference. So this is a conference on digital humanities. But if you look at the program, there is not that much on the topic of disinformation discussed outside of this keynote talk. So I was thinking, where do you see the benefit for this community from what you presented? Are we going to see more convergences in the future in terms of tools, approaches, methods? Obviously, it's a data-intensive area these days, and digital humanities are also data-intensive. But what else is beneficial for this community from your point of view? Thank you.
Oh, wow, thank you so much. And thank you for also, I think, as someone who's been monitoring mis and disinformation for a very long time, like you really just feel, and thank you for the organizers of this event, you just feel lucky to be included because there's a lot that goes on in the digital rights space, and we've not really had a lot of attention on fact checking and disinformation. So from my standpoint, having been part of not only this conference, but also other conferences that were around digital rights and digital humanities, I acknowledge that there's need for both of us to disinformation experts as well as digital humanities experts and people in the digital rights space to exchange and collaborate. There's just a lot of intersection. For example, just in previous conferences, learning about the use of spyware, for example, and there's a lot of intersection, and I agree with you that there's need for collaboration in these spaces, because I benefit a lot from learning other ways that the online space is being used to cause harm. And I think digital humanities experts have even like tangible examples, for example, with like the use of spyware. And also as disinformation experts, we mostly feel like we're shouting in the void, because most of our output is through what reports, or as a journalist, it's through an article. And for example, as you mentioned, the IFCN space or the fact-checking space is very small. So it's important not just for the people who are in the space, but even for public awareness, if these collaborations can expand between different organizations, between different experts, as long as you're in the internet space, because there's a lot of intersections. As for fact checking as a business model, that is a very, very it's quite a crucial point, because, so I'd give you an example of my previous workplace. I've worked at Code for Africa before, and I've worked at an organization called Piga Firimbi before. Piga Firimbi is by Africans, and it was independent, it was just starting, it wasn't even IFCN verified. But most times we'd really just latch on big organizations like IFCN signatories to like bring us on board. So sometimes they would like offer us grants to contribute to a report that they're working on. So the space is also very limited to specific people, because IFCN has, again, a partnership with Meta, which is, again, conflicting, because how can you verify the same person that is funding you? But again, I do appreciate, as a business model, it has helped fact checkers like acquire resources to, again, these tools, acquire resources, even besides the kind of work. So for example, IFCN would require 170 fact checks in a month. And with that kind of money, you can both hire people, deliver for the IFCN and Meta requirements, but also you can use the resources to investigate independent projects that, you know, could possibly have a bigger impact. So as a business model, it's been a little shifty and honestly not so reliable, especially if you're not part of the IFCN signatories like that. And again, there's the limit of, for example, with the access to CrowdTangle, again, we had to rely on bigger fact-checking organizations, because they're the only ones who had access to CrowdTangle. Even with the stories we did, we had to ask them to get to grant us access to like these platforms. So as a business model, it's a bit shifty and weird like that. But for, as you have mentioned, like long-term impacts of code for practices on disinformation, I like that you've mentioned the EU, and we as journalists and disinformation experts in Africa usually refer back to a lot of what the EU has done. And I forget the particular case, but through these policies that are currently increasingly recognizing disinformation. I know that there's a case that would use, for example, screenshots as evidence in a court of law. And to hear such a case happening, it's quite encouraging, because now we're beginning to recognize that the digital space has so much impact, and what people are saying and the kind of engagement going on can actually be used as evidence. It's also something that Kenya recently copied in its laws, introducing the electronic evidence bill, where again screenshots can be used as evidence in a court of law. So I think there's need for, again, policymakers to appreciate the role of disinformation in causing physical harm, and also not trivialize the kind of harm that goes on online spaces, and making a case for it to actually be tested in a court of law. For example, the use of revenge porn should be something that should get tried and charged and put someone behind bars in the modern world. So yeah, I hope I've covered all the questions, but those are more for me to like contemplate on as well. Yeah, I hope that pretty much covers it, although there's still a lot more on the same questions.
Thank you, Linda. I think we have, unfortunately, only time for one more question. I have a question from Muchiri Online, who would like to thank you for your presentation. And Muchiri asks, I'm curious what your experience has been regarding youth activism in Kenya. What trends have emerged, if any?
Yeah, I don't know if I have time to share my screen again, but I could answer that question forever, but I can just draw back to the current protests. I don't know. Okay, I may just. Okay, I can just answer it without having to share my screen, but there's a report that came out trying to analyze the way the current protests in Kenya have been going, and just in Kenya in particular, youth protests have been mostly online. And then, so for example, there's a parliamentarian who said when the protests that are currently going on, trying to make changes, which have made actual changes, for example, by stopping the passing of the finance bill that was going to increase taxes. So before these changes happened, we'd hear parliamentarians, for example, in a parliament reading, they would say things like, oh, the young people are just doing it for TikTok. They just want to trend. So these would be their arguments. And because there's not enough young people in parliament, the bill was indeed passed. And that kind of brought about a lot of rage. And now the protests that followed on the next week, they were more intense. And that's when the government kind of brought in police, and that broke out the trend of police brutality in the current protests. But it is becoming increasingly crucial for even leaders. I'm proud to say, like, for example, in Kenya, we have the first president who hosted a forum on X Spaces. So the leader had to come down to our level and actually listen to it's called the Gen Z movement. He had to host a space on Twitter, formerly X, formerly Twitter, and listen to people through that platform. So I thought that was new and interesting. So he's gotten to a point where he has to listen and meet people where they are. And again, because of the youth-led movement, we can no longer ignore social media as a space for impacting change. But again, as it is a double-edged sword, we have seen again the misuse of youth to be paid as influencers And because of X has become like basically the most engaging platform lately. So because of the change in platform policies, now everyone can get verified. So in one of the stories I've actually covered, you'd find someone who is making it a business. So politicians would pay young people because they need the money, and they would pay for subscriptions on X, and they would use these platforms to counter narrative the kind of protests that are going on. So there was, for example, a trend that was sponsored claiming that these protests are trying to bring in queer laws, and all they've been sponsored by Russia. So we are also seeing that the disinformation space is evolving in the way counter narratives are being shaped lately, because never before had we had Russia in conversations, local conversations like we are right now. So again, people are getting aware of pro-Russia, anti-Russia, or pro-Israeli, anti-Israeli narratives, which are not very common locally. But again, the space is growing for civic engagement that is genuine and organic, but it's also becoming very sophisticated in the way perpetrators of false information are organizing. And thanks to the change in platform policies, you can have someone with a verified account getting more traction because of the algorithm, but is basically being paid to push counter narratives. So that's, yeah, that's big, an actual of what's going on in Kenya and young people and civic engagement, but it's been a very interesting space to watch, actually.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. A question that came in online is Andre asks, are there any clear tools that you would recommend to distinguish between misinformation and propaganda?
So, as I mentioned with the information ecosystem, so misinformation would be, it would, let me just mention the traits of propaganda or smear campaigns so that you can use that as a metric for what is misinformation or what isn't. But from the background, misinformation is spread without the intent to cause harm. It could be me or you who are well-meaning people, but smear campaigns and propaganda could have paid actors behind them. So you would notice, for example, in the kind of work we've been working around coordinated inauthentic behavior, there is the use of the same phrases and words verbatim across different accounts, which is not normal for maybe even 3 people cannot think exactly in the same way to post in the exact same way. So disinformation, smear campaigns and propaganda are organized like that. You'd find several posts that are exactly the same. We've also noticed that there's the use of maybe 2 or 3 exact hashtags on each and every post. And that is usually used so that if one hashtag doesn't trend, another one is picked up. So there's copying word for word verbatim on the text. You'd find across different accounts, there's the use of the same images or videos, just the same content across different accounts. And you can also look out for accounts that kind of repeat and comment on specific accounts only. And also we heavily rely on tools, for example, to help us find out what time a campaign ran. So mostly they ran for like 2 hours. You find the same exact words used in a specific time frame. Mostly you'd find that organic posts would come after a specific window, but usually they're organized to trend. For example, they'd say within 2 hours, you have to post these exact words, and that kind of brings the phrase or the topic high up on the trends. But yeah, the tools and looking out for repeated words and images across numerous accounts, if that helps. That's just like the basics of it.
All right, great, thank you. I'd love to give Linda a round of applause for joining us. Um, Thank you so much. We're very sorry that we were able to be here in person, but we really appreciate, on behalf of the organizers and everyone else, this really fascinating presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. It was nice to be here.
Thank you so much, Linda. All right. We're off to start our next sessions. There will be a coffee break in the lobby, and thank you very much for attending.
It's not very far. I think as long as I have the copy, I'll be okay. Yeah.
So Zoom forced Linda to update, so she had to download Zoom. Yeah, but she logged in earlier today.
Should I share like a Google Slides? I think you mentioned that there's like, it needs to be on this computer to Zoom.
Yes, I also brought like USB adapter kind of thing if you need it. Let's see, because I was just waiting, so end of the slideshow. Okay. Kind of instruction, so it's going to be.
You're fine.
So,
Seems like these conferences are always just very fun.
yeah, I think what we can do, because I also need to, yeah, I guess log in the. Let's see. Yes, it's right. Organize and log in. Otherwise, I can. Let's see. How are we doing? A bit nervous?
Pretty good.
Yeah,
Pretty good.
that's nice.
It'll be okay. There's like, I like having this giant podium.
I
and
agree.
Stand in front of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's really helpful now in the morning. Yeah, okay. Enter. Let's see. Let's see. No, and I'm not able to access because I think it's not. Okay, I'm gonna go, and otherwise I can connect my.
Yeah, no, okay.
Yeah, but we can upload. You have a USB or something? I have it in case.
Yeah, like a USB drive. Oh, and I just put the slides on. Yeah, in case it's technical issues.
That's the USB, and it's called Sony. Sony's Sony, and that's the adapter if you need it. I'm gonna go and close some, and be right back. They are coming.
Okay.
So I think we can just save your presentation on the desktop here, and then you can delete it at the end, of course, if you want. So,
Okay. Sounds good.
so yeah, I don't know. So I think.
Yeah, I mean, being the first presentation of the
I
conference.
will be seated.